Okay, let's continue talking about communication variables. Moving on to channel now. So, channels are basically how did you send the message? And we're going to go talk about as we go through the quarter all the different ways that channels can impact things. A lot of times, what channel impacts is either how somebody interprets something or maybe just how freely they'll communicate. So, let's start out with like if you're just one on one with somebody, like how what gets impacted there. Well, typically it's who else is in the room is the first factor. So sometimes depending on who else is in the room, it can make people more or less comfortable talking or discussing something. If some of the other people in the room are more alpha personality, sometimes they can take over the discussion, and sometimes that's good, like there needs to be a leader, and then sometimes it's bad, right, because you don't get other people to open up. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and how it affects culture in different ways. So you have that, or sometimes in terms of channel, certain channels can actually make people upset. So, for example, let's say you send something in an email, right, or posting something on social media or online. What typically gets people in trouble, in those situations? The first thing that kind of gets people upset typically is that anybody can view it, right? So if you post something online, you're essentially just broadcasting it to the world, right? Anybody, even if you take it down, right? It's not necessarily lost forever. So anybody can view it, and sometimes that can get you in some trouble, like where people are upset that you sort of posted something as public knowledge that they didn't want out there. And certainly an email can be like that, because you can take an email and you could just blind forward it to someone, right? Nobody knows you sent it, all that sort of stuff. So usually that's what gets people in trouble in those situations. Another sort of problem with the channel of using, say, social media or the internet or an email or even a text message, because if you think about it, a text message could also be forwarded, is it's hard to read the nonverbals. We have a whole section later about nonverbals, and you've probably heard that phrase, 90% of communication is nonverbal, right? And what people mean by that is like the real meaning we take from a situation, usually it's nonverbals. We actually read more into that than people's language. And so if you're using these sort of text-based channels, you're losing all the nonverbals, right? And so it can be hard for people to kind of understand something. But so channel can really have a big impact. And to give you kind of a quick example of that, like a hypothetical here is, so let's say you're going to break up with somebody. So the question is, should you break up with them in a text message? Now notice I said should, not like can you. Because one of the biggest cop outs in the world is like somebody does something, they get called out on it, right? Shouldn't have done that, bad guy. And then they go, well, technically I had a right to. I mean, it's not illegal what I did, right? Like, there's usually what you can do and what you should do, right? Just because you can do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, right? So should you break up with somebody in a text? That's the question. Now, they'll do focus groups on this where you study. These are where you get people in a room and you ask them questions over a series of like an hour, and you're just asking them these questions about different aspects of relationships. I one time was involved in a focus group where this guy in there, I don't remember what the show was, but it was some sort of like an HBO show or something. And so it was on a premium channel or premium like streaming service. And the guy said he was waiting to break up with his girlfriend until the show ended because he didn't have that service. He was using her. He was just watching the show with her on her account. So yeah, that's the dating pool out there. Slim pickings, I guess. So, but anyway, in these focus groups, I'll ask people like when it comes to breakups, different things that upset them, all that sort of stuff. So overwhelmingly, when you ask people, you got broken up with on a text message versus in person, what do you think of that? And they all hate it, right? They'll say things. I mean, you probably know what they say, right? They'll say things like, I didn't get closure, or I felt like it showed little respect for me, or that because they didn't really put any effort, they just sent me a text. There was no effort here to sort of like care about my feelings in the situation. And so they feel kind of like jilted that way and all this sorts of stuff. And if you think about, or they, again, not did you not show respect for me, but then what did our whole relationship mean? Like there's all these things people report, and they just kind of feel like it's cold for the most part. And by the way, those are not like emotional, illogical, irrational responses. Like those are actually very logical. There's very logical, rational reasons you feel that way. So first of all, it literally takes less effort, as you know, to send a text than meet with somebody. So of course they feel like you didn't put much effort into it and you don't care very much, or they feel disrespected, right? You did disrespect them. You put less effort into the breakup. right? Not getting closure. Of course, they're going to feel that way because in a text message, if you're one-on-one and you're asking people questions, you're going to get answers. Even if you don't get answers right, you're going to get body language, stuff like that. But in a text message, they could just stop responding to you, right? In the midway through, they could block you, right? So of course you're not going to get closure because they can just end the conversation. Another reason why, going back to the nonverbals, you might not feel like you're getting closure is because you're not reading the emotions of the situation, right? So everybody overwhelmingly pans this, that, don't break up with people in text. And obviously, look, I should clarify, there's an exception to this, like where if you're in, for example, an abusive situation, right, where it would be dangerous to do something in person, then by all means break up with people in a text or an email, right? There's also people that sometimes choose to do that, particularly with an email, because they have a hard time. They feel like they'll have a hard time in the moment saying what they want to say, right? Getting it out the right way. And so they send it in a text or an email to make sure they said exactly what they wanted to say. I think you're going to get, like, the focus groups anyway will report that sometimes you do get some understanding in those situations from the recipient, but you need to be clear, like, hey, I'm doing this to make sure things are said the right way and that it's not like a cold thing, because otherwise they'll take it that way as it just being cold and not getting closure and all that sorts of stuff. Disrespectful, right? So, continuing on this example, like, let's just say whatever the perfect thing is to say when you're going to break up with somebody, like, just a team of like Hollywood rom-com writers wrote the breakup scene for you. It's just beautiful, right? And so it's the perfect thing, but it's still a text. How do you think it's going to get received? Not well, right? So they're going to get that text. You said all the right things, and they're still going to kill you. It's not going to matter, right? It's a whisper on a scream. It doesn't mean anything, right? If everybody else is screaming in a room and you're whispering, nobody can hear you, right? So here's the point. A channel can ruin the perfect message. You can be saying the right thing. You can be right in the point you're making, but if you choose the wrong channel, nobody will care and you will get killed for it, right? Because it was a text, that alone is going to speak the highest volume, no matter what you say. So you got to be careful about that. And I also think kind of related to channel is considering like psychological context. I mentioned that was like the baggage of a situation. But, one of the things too that happens with channels now, what I'm seeing, and again, maybe this is like half an issue with the channel and half an issue with like psychological, like read the room, psychological context, which is you will see situations where I've certainly seen this a lot on social media, right? Where somebody says something and the point they're making might kind of be right. It's actually not that bad. But they get killed, right? And the reason they're getting killed is they're not reading the room. In other words, wrong place, wrong time, even if you're right. So when you have something to say like that, and you're going to choose, especially if you're going to choose a channel, like if we're talking about the channel of the internet and social media, one of the other things about that is you are inviting people into the conversation and discussion who you don't know and you may not want there, aka haters on social media, right? Like the people that are going to kill you. And so you also got to read like psychological context into some of what I'm basically trying to say is that one of the things that makes channels really fraught with potential minefields is people aren't reading the psychological context. In other words, reading the moment of, is this the right time to say this? And so I guess I might not be explaining very, very well, but what I'm trying to say is sometimes when you have something to say, even if you're right, you still got to ask, is it the right method, which is the channel thing? So this breakup example, and is it the right time to use this channel, right? And so if you're going to use a channel like social media or the internet, right, that can go anywhere. And if you didn't pick the right time, your message could be right and you could get killed. Like I've seen a lot of examples of that too, where it's not that I think in the abstract the person said something so awful, but they're going to get killed because it just wasn't the right time or place, right? And obviously people get killed. Sometimes they do deserve it, right? Like, it's kind of like this notion where like sometimes people deserve the criticism they're getting, right? But I'm talking about scenarios where maybe what you were saying was fair and you had a right to say it, but you got to pick and choose the right time and place, that psychological context, and then the right channel, right? And that's of course dealing with channels. So maybe didn't explain that very well. Hopefully I did. If you're not sure, feel free to ask me. So channels just affect how people interpret things, basically, right? Even if you have the perfect message. Okay, so let's go to feedback. This is probably the least intuitive. A lot of people think you can't manipulate feedback, but you can. So feedback's responses to a message. So it would be like, and I use this example in the in-person classes a lot of times, is if I come into class and it's one of the first days, and I just point somebody out and I say, isn't it true that you're a scumbag? Now, there's a couple ways you can respond to that. Be like, you could be defensive, right? Which is the most likely scenario. Be like, I'm not a scumbag. How dare you call me that, right? You could say it's true. You've been watching my YouTube channel. You've been watching my vlog, right? You've seen my internet search history, right? You've been watching my girlfriend's YouTube channel, right? You could deny it. You could say it's true. You could respond any way you want. But here's why I'm controlling feedback, and this is a phrase that attorneys will use. Detectives, like police investigators, will sometimes use this phrase. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but the phrase is as follows: whoever is asking questions is in any situation is in control. Now, why is that? Because they're controlling the topic. No matter how you respond to that question, we are talking about whether or not you're a scumbag. Right? So I'm controlling things. Now, that's an extreme example to illustrate the point, but bringing it back to like communication in like a persuasion context, it would be like if I come in the room and I'm giving a speech. I teach public speaking as well. You come in the room, you're giving a speech, and I say, who wants to make money? Who likes money? Who wants to shave 10 hours off their work week? In other words, who wants to save time? That's the same thing as, isn't it true you're a scumbag? All I did was I walked in the room and I said, who likes money? Look, squirrel over here, right? Save time, save time, save time. And I'm getting you to focus on money and saving time. It's the same concept. So this is called label implanting, where I keep bringing up a concept or a topic or a theme over and over and over to get you to care about that or focus on it, right? And I can do it with the question, which I use to illustrate the point, but like that's more realistic of how you do it with communication. So we're going to talk about that. What are the hot button things to get people to focus on from a cultural standpoint? But that's a way to manipulate feedback, is you're kind of steering things. Now, sometimes you're doing this in a very like positive, genuine way. So in other words, I can walk in the room and say, who wants to make money or who wants to save time? And maybe it's true, whatever it is I'm telling you or selling you is going to make you money and save you time. It might really, really do those things, right? But if we're going to be a little cynical, I like to be cynical sometimes, right? If we're going to be a little cynical, sometimes people are doing that for like nefarious reasons. So in other words, they're saying, ooh, look, squirrel, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Wizard of Oz reference. I'm not sure if it's before or after Wicked, because I haven't seen it yet. I think I would like it, but I haven't seen it, so I'm not sure. The story, from what I know, sounds interesting, sounds intriguing. But old Wizard of Oz movie reference, where they're figuring out who Oz is, and he's like, once the jig is up, right, he's like, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, look over here, right? So, in other words, sometimes somebody walks in the room and they're like, who likes money? Because they want you to think about all the money you're going to make and not pay attention to everything else they're saying or their background or something else that's like so many holes in their story that you could drive a Mack truck through, right? Because you're so focused on money. And to give you an example of this like manipulation of what you're focused on from like my field, is one of the ironies about like financial cons or crimes. You know, these people that like scam people out of all kinds of money, is that a financial con artist actually takes advantage of the victim's greed. I mean, they're greedy, obviously, because they're stealing people's money, but they look for greedy victims, right? Because they walk in the room typically, and they're like, who lacks money? And those people are like, man, I want a 50% turn on my investment within 10 days, instead of like checking out the person's background and their story and realizing that they're full of it, right? And so these are kind of different ways you can manipulate feedback. So we're going to come back through all of these concepts as we get through the class, but I just want to give you some basic examples to remember you can control these things. And again, the reason it matters to control these dynamics is you've really got two choices. They're going to happen either way, right? We're going to get to a slide that mentions that in general principles in a second. Like, Feedback is involved in any situation, right? Noise is in any situation. Meta messages and meaning and verbals and nonverbals, these are all there no matter what. You might as well be managing them, right? You might as well be trying to manipulate them in the right way for you. So, some general principles to just keep in mind, this would apply to any communication course. Successful communication does not always involve shared meaning. Like sometimes people are just going to have to agree to disagree. You don't want to literally say that. We're going to talk about that later, but it sounds a little like I'm taking my ball and going home. I don't want to play anymore, and nobody likes that. But it's true that like sometimes people just don't agree on what something means, and you're not going to get a shared meaning. And certainly intercultural communication, as we go through that topic, you're going to see that, right? And that kind of happens because cultures tend to have ingrained in them certain perspectives on how they're going to view a situation, and sometimes those are really opposed, right? And so you're not always going to get shared meaning. Really, what you're looking for is outcomes that are satisfactory or good for both parties in an event, but not necessarily shared meaning. It doesn't solve all problems. This is very much an old man phrase, okay? I'm getting old, though. Sorry does not fix the lamp. Maybe your parents, your grandparents said that. What that is trying to say is like you can do something that causes damage or harm or alters the way people perceive you, and you can't just talk your way out of it, man. Like it doesn't, like the words, like the toothpaste is out of the tube, right? And you can't just talk your way out of it. So like choose your actions. You've probably heard that phrase, choose your words wisely. Words matter. They do, but choose your actions, right? Because you can cause certain harm that you can't talk your way out of. More is always better. That is not always true either. Sometimes you need to take time to think about it. I think the classic example of this that you probably already experienced is like when you're in a fight and you really need to take time to cool off, but you keep fighting because you either want to resolve it or in the heat of the moment, and you say things you either don't mean, or whether you mean them or not, you didn't want to say because they hurt the other person, they serve no useful purpose, right? So just, there is something to be said for like realizing it's not always better to just keep going down that rabbit hole of communicating, right? Sometimes you do need to walk away. So we're going to talk a little bit about that too. Other principles. It's always occurring, whether intentional or not. So this goes back to don't drift because, hey, feedback, verbals, nonverbals, messages, meaning, social content, psychological context, it's all happening. They're making decisions and judgments about you, perceptions, which is their reality again. So you might as well manipulate it, right? You might as well use it in a way that's going to, and again, I say manipulation in the sense of like a positive thing, right? Meaning to get a positive outcome for everybody. I'm not suggesting you take advantage of people or anything like that. It's more about how do I get the best case scenario, right? For everyone. Communication. So it's always occurring. You might as well manage it as best you can. It can be irreversible. So this kind of goes back to a point I just made, which is that sometimes you can say something and people never view you the same. Like we're going to have a section where we talk a little bit about disclosure. So like when you tell people things, what does that do? And by the way, it's something that again, we don't always tell little Billy and little Johnny when they're 5. This might surprise you, but one of the things that we're going to talk about is that guess what? Honesty is not always the best policy. Sometimes the truth does nothing in a situation but have harmful effects to the person you're communicating with or their perception of you, and it doesn't serve a useful purpose. So again, I'm not advocating that you willfully lie to people or deceive people or all that sort of stuff. Or I'm not, and most of the times it is best to be honest. But what I'm saying is we're going to talk about that you can say things that alter how people view you and react to you, and you're not going to be able to fix it anymore. I mean, I've experienced that in my life. I had a close friend for a lot of years, as close as any friend can be. And there was an event where something was said and it kind of altered that friendship forever. And because of what was said. And I just could never really get over that, what was said. Right. So this happens. And so we're going to talk about that. Obviously, again, from a cultural lens, what are some things like that could be minefields? And then it has a content relational component. Now, what I mean by that is when you're communicating with somebody, the content component is what's the subject? The relational component is what does this say about us? So let's say you're fighting with your significant other. The content component is whatever you're fighting about. The relational component is maybe how we're fighting, what does that say about us? So if it's an abusive relationship, physically or mentally, right, that says something about their level of respect for you, what behavior they think is appropriate and okay and acceptable, right? And it's when you read those things into it, that's the relational component. Another like common everyday example would be like, let's say you need to talk to somebody because you just need to get something off your chest, or you need somebody to vent to. So whatever you talk about is a substance component, excuse me. But the fact that you would confide in that person, that's the relational component, because it says something about how close you are to them, right? So that's the relational component. And the reason I bring that up is because sometimes in a situation, the really big takeaway from this, if you remember something from this slide, is that you sometimes have to know what's more important in a situation. A lot of times it's just the content component that's what matters, but there's other times when the relational component is more important. Like there's relationships like that where it's not the fights that broke up the relationship, it's how you fought, it's how you dealt with conflict, right? That chipped away at it, right? So you have to keep that in mind. Sometimes the relational component is what really matters in a given situation. So we'll come back to that. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. All right, getting into some cultural specifics, and certainly for the rest of the course, we'll obviously be focusing on all these things from this angle. But let's talk a little bit about cultural communication in general. Some initial tent poles of like understanding of principles before we start to, as we go through the next couple of weeks, get more in depth into all this. So first of all, what is culture? So the definition that I'm proposing to you here is that it's a group of people with shared identity, affiliation, and norms. So in other words, a group of people that identify themselves as belonging to a shared group, and they have similar like normal patterns of behavior or beliefs, right? So we identify as part of the group and we tend to like act, believe, and behave the same way. Okay. They can include, so it says elements, they can often include things like affiliation. So again, that's like group involvements, beliefs and behaviors. So this is again, mindsets, the ways we do things. So think of customary practices, traditions, things like that. Communication styles. This can vary by culture. Not every culture, right? But some of them have different communication styles. And also usually a cultural group or a group you identify with also has a shared historical experience. Okay. And it says here the deep structure of culture resists major change. We talk more about deep structure coming up, but what deep structure basically just means is the really roots, the tent poles, the strongly held beliefs, right, that are within a culture. This would be like in American culture, democracy is the best form of government. That is a deep-rooted structural thing, okay, that really does resist change, okay? I think you could argue religious from either a Christian Catholic denomination, like religious principles, even if people aren't religious themselves or don't identify themselves as religious, like you could be agnostic, you could be an atheist, you don't have to be religious, but I still think various religious principles, particularly like moral kind of principles, they are ingrained in American culture, right? They're really deep rooted in a lot of our just like structural beliefs. So those are deep structure. We're going to talk more about that a little bit later. Now, one of the things that you should kind of like should jump out at you here, I just want to make a note of is so in other words, what I'm telling you here is culture just isn't just some like ethnic thing, right? Or nationality thing, like which country you're a citizen of. It could be any group. It could be your job. It can be fandom. I'm a huge baseball fan and Atlanta Braves fan. Just for full disclosure here, and so me being like a diehard fan of that team, I would identify as part of that team's fan base, right? As part of that group. Music styles can be their own genre, their own culture, right? Music genres. So like people that listen to a certain type of music, like go to any concert and everybody's kind of dressed almost the same, right? Because it can become its own little culture. So it's really any group that you just think it's important to be a member of. I mean, in today's sort of modern society, I mean, heck, I think you could extend that to like a popular podcast that you listen to or a YouTube channel where you watch all of the videos and a creator that you've followed through the years, right? Like you start to identify as a member of that community, right? So culture really has this large tent. We tend to think of it as just a lot of people will just walk around thinking of it as like ethnicity or nationality. It's bigger than that, right? And you can belong to you probably belong to 20 cultures, right? Different little groups. And we'll talk about this later. There's basically like dominant cultures and subcultures. So a music genre would be a subculture, right? It's a small culture that only that group is sort of only a few people are a member of. The larger dominant culture would be things like America or democracy or something like that, right? So it's basically a group you belong to with these characteristics. So that's what culture is. And then what intercultural communication is, just like it sounds, it's a communicative interaction between people from different groups, right? So people in these different groups, when they communicate, that's intercultural communication. So what we're kind of studying is what do you got to, what we're going to talk about here is what do you have to know about the groups to do this well, right? And for certain groups, it's one thing, and for another group, it's another thing, right? It depends on the group a little bit, like what matters to them substantively. There's some groups that care more about the relational than the substance component of a message. It's sort of how you do things that matters, not necessarily the terms of the deal or what you're actually talking about. But that's basically what it is, just like communication between different groups. So if you think about it, you engage in this all the time. Like I'm sure you communicate with people from different groups, right? And so we do this all the time. Even if it's not like ethnic based or nationality based. So that's intercultural communication. Why does it matter in a broader sense is because we're exposed to more cultures and more diverse groups than at any point in human history. And because of obviously the internet and technological advances, we're just so connected now to anywhere in the world we want to be connected to, right? So cultural changes and exposure to different ones has increased, and that's why this matters. It's becoming more and more important, particularly if you're going to go into business or be an entrepreneur, and you want to be you want your content and your message to be accessible to a variety of people. So all of this changes, and by the way, cultural changes is because these cultures are influencing each other, right? You're around other people, so you start to get influenced by that, right? So those changes have happened, and exposure to different cultures has happened for a variety of things. So the first thing is obviously the increase of information technology. That's the internet essentially bringing different perspectives and different people together, right? For good and for bad, right? In a good way is there can be cultural, cross-cultural enrichment. Cultures learn from each other and develop like positive things, right? And in a bad way, this is like if you think of like negative comments or hordes on social media or destructive groups that like online can like gather and organize and things like that, right? It's for negative for not for good, right? For negative sort of impacts. So it's kind of good or bad, but the increase in technology has certainly been a big reason why we communicate now across cultures more. Increased cross-cultural business. So this is just again being exposed to different groups and wanting your business to reach different groups. And again, to just kind of illustrate to illustrate to you how this isn't just an ethnic or nationality thing. This is sort of like saying, when Nike wants to stay as a number one in apparel brand, right? They're probably number one. I think that's pretty clear. If they want to stay that way, and they're fighting with Under Armour, for example, it's when they try to make decisions that say, how can our brand reach a high schooler and a 60-year-old? How can it reach the high schooler and that middle-aged person, right? These are different groups, right? They're different groups, certainly in terms of like generations. You have Generation X and like these different generations, baby boomers, right? Like how can we reach these different groups? So businesses now have to think about that because if you can reach multiple groups or cultures, you're obviously going to make more money, and that's the goal, right? And also, it's just a reality that you're going to be dealing with more groups because we're so connected. And then, of course, the other factor is immigration, right? Where people, they travel to other countries a lot. It doesn't have to be like actual re-residency, but just the international travel, immigration across borders of different countries, right? All of that is just feeding in, right, to making this more and more important. So that's basically why we care so much about it. So as we go through the course, obviously from this point forward, we're going to be heavily focused on all of these things. Again, verbals, nonverbals, relationships, conflict resolution, all of these different dynamics from an intercultural communication perspective, from communicating with different weeks. So I hope this discussion has been helpful in explaining some of these initial concepts. If you do have questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to discuss them with you. Or, of course, perhaps online one-on-one over Zoom. So I will see you guys in our next discussion.